We as humans have the right to live on this planet, and so do the flora and fauna. We have a responsibility to protect Earth, humankind, and all living and non-living things we share it with. Unless we want to lose that right, we must preserve and protect our home. One of the biggest reasons we study history is to learn from our past. One example of this protection is through the national park system, where governments and citizens work together to keep the nature of our world clean and accessible. National parks provide the same insight in a way that shows the growth of humanity and nature. More specifically, the first national park, Yellowstone, has highlighted the preservation of an area of land since its founding. Yellowstone has the most active, diverse, and intact collections of combined geothermal features with over 10,000 hydrothermal sites and half the world's active geysers. Now, there are 63 national parks in the U.S. and more than 6,500 in the entire world.
In the early and mid-1800s, explorers, trappers, and the U.S. government moved west. With the expansion in this direction, rumors of a place where the earth hissed and bubbled, where multicolored hot springs and spouting geysers filled the landscape, started to gain traction. It attracted the attention of people and the federal government. John Muir, a naturalist and father of the national park, made his report about the mystical Yellowstone. He wrote with great enthusiasm about Yellowstone. The air is electric and full of ozone, healing, reviving, exhilarating, kept pure by frost and fire, while the scenery is wild enough to awaken the dead. John would camp in Yellowstone for weeks at a time to explore and learn about the park. From these lovely dens, you may make excursions whenever you like into the middle of the park, where the geysers and hot springs are reeking and spouting in their beautiful basins, displaying an exuberance of color and strange motion and energy admirably calculated to surprise and frighten, charm and shake up the least sensitive out of apathy into newness of life. Muir's activism and efforts went on to help raise awareness for the unique beauty of the area and helped Americans and the government see the importance of preserving that very beauty. He advocated for Mother Nature, but showed that her beauty speaks for herself.
William Jackson, a photographer during the period, had worked with a man named Ferdinand Hayden, a journalist for Scribner's Monthly. For a brief period after Hayden visited the landscape and wrote an article about it in his following paper, he notably mentioned Jackson and his photographs. There was also a man named Thomas Moran, famous for his artwork of Yellowstone. He and Jackson's photograph portfolios were submitted to the 42nd Congress, and on March 1st, 1872, they passed the Yellowstone Act that made Yellowstone the first official national park. On top of that, 18th President Ulysses Grant signed the Yellowstone Protection Act the same day, going hand in hand and providing the first base for national park protection services. There are 27 indigenous tribes that have original ties with the land that is now known as Yellowstone. Long before Yellowstone was established as a national park, it was a place where Native Americans lived, hunted, fished, gathered plants, quarried obsidian, and used thermal waters for religious and medicinal purposes. These native peoples were removed from the areas and relocated by the U.S. military. Unfortunately, while the U.S. government agreed that the Yellowstone region belonged to the various local indigenous tribes in the treaties of Fort Laramie, the establishment of Yellowstone National Park in 1872 spelled the end of indigenous occupation within the park boundaries. False rumors were then spread about the natives' attitude toward the land, that they feared the thermal features and avoided the areas entirely. Debunking these myths are important to understand a fuller view of this complex history. Recognition of indigenous peoples' presence in Yellowstone is important for understanding this region's full and storied history. As of 2024, 250-plus co-stewardship agreements exist between the National Park Service and tribal nations to collaboratively manage resources, protect cultural sites, and support indigenous stewardship within national parks. Must work together to ensure inclusion of tribal priorities, values, and stories. The history of this land is as volatile and tumultuous as its terrain. While the past cannot be erased, today we come together to tell a more transparent truth of the history of the human interactions with the nature of the land. This particular subject requires much more time and attention because of its complexities and nuances, which we don't have time to fully explore in this video. We encourage you to investigate this topic on your own, as there are other perspectives to recognize. A major problem with the newly formed park was people who posed threats to the livelihoods of the ecosystem and environment, such as poachers and vandals. The park needed better protection from these dangers, so they went back to the drawing board. During Roosevelt's presidency, he signed the Antiquities Act of 1909. This act ensured the protection of lands for natural resources and historic and cultural importance. Other beneficial acts quickly followed. One important act was the Organic Act of 1916. The act created the government agency now known as the National Park Protection Service, or NPS. This act ensured that there would be people to stand up for the parks, and that there would be people who care for them and the historic value that they bring.
In 1929, President Hoover signed the first bill to change Yellowstone's boundary to fit Yellowstone's unique geography and ecosystems, and work better with the surrounding nature. Then, in 1932, Hoover signed an executive order that expanded the park by over 7,000 acres for the betterment of the wildlife. Lakes, rivers, mountains, fields, and meadows were used to fit the park's biodiverse areas as much as possible. The foundation that is now Yellowstone inspired others to continue pushing for the preservation of lands. Theodore Roosevelt, during his presidency, became one of these inspired few. He established approximately 230 million acres of public lands, 150 national forests, 5 national parks, 55 bird reservations, and 18 national monuments. Roosevelt also wrote many books such as Hunting Trips of a Ranchman, The Wilderness Hunter, and Outdoor Pastimes of an American Hunter. Within these books, he makes notes and claims about all the places he visits. There can be nothing in the world more beautiful than the Yosemite, the groves of the giant sequoias and redwoods, the canyon of the Colorado, the canyon of the Yellowstone, the Three Tetons, and our people should see to it that they are preserved for their children and their children's children forever, with their majestic beauty all unmarred.
Overall, there were many people who contributed to the birth of the first national park, from passionate activists to several presidents of the United States of America. Yellowstone's unmatched beauty and uniqueness were something that couldn't be ignored. These people knew their responsibility to our world. It needs to be recognized, preserved, and protected. We take on these responsibilities in order to protect our right to a beautiful world. Yellowstone National Park has gone on to foster a thriving ecosystem of flora and fauna, as well as preserve historical, cultural, and geological wonders.
It's my honor to introduce a compassionate conservationist, President George W. Bush.
Thank you, Madam Secretary. Thank you, Dara. Thank you all very much. Thank you. As long as we're willing to show careful regard for the environment, this is a great responsibility. I strongly believe our country is equal to it. When men and women walk into a setting like this, we must walk with care. Of all the forces on Earth, only man is capable of cutting down a sequoia, and only man is capable of fully appreciating its beauty.